Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aisha Salman, and I am the Business Intelligence Analyst for the American Supply Association. Thank you for taking out time from your daily routine to join us for this webinar. I hope you and your family and coworkers are staying safe and healthy. Thank you. As you know, with approximately 4,000 deaths, 3 million unemployed and counting, and no definite end in sight, the coronavirus has upended nearly every aspect of the American life. In the last 2 weeks, we've had the Federal Reserve and Congress scramble to pass policies and mitigate what may become a deep recession. Business across the country are asking what exactly is going on economically. Is the government responding effectively? How do we set ourselves up for economic recovery once the pandemic recedes? ASA cares deeply about its members' growth and always strives to bring our membership information and materials that matter. In our quest to keep our members informed in such unprecedented times, ASA Chief Economist Dr. Chris Kuehl is conducting a series of webinars to help members gain an understanding on how this current crisis will affect business. Dr. Kuehl has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet studies and Asian studies, and was a professor of international economics and finance for more than 15 years, prior to co-founding Armada Corporate Intelligence, where he is the managing director. In addition to working with ASA, Dr. Kuehl is the chief economist for the National Association for Credit Management. He prepares NACM's monthly Credit Managers Index. He is also the economic analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association and writes their bi-weekly publication, Fabrinomics, which details the impact of economic trends on manufacturers. Dr. Kuehl is also the chief editor for the Business Intelligence Brief, distributed around the world by business organizations, and one of the primary writers for the Black Owl Report. He also makes more than 100 presentations each year to business and industry associations in the U.S. as well as overseas, including ASA's annual network event. In our first webinar, U.S. at the Epicenter, Dr. Kuehl will examine what prompted the current economic reaction and how much damage can be expected as the U.S. adapts to lockdowns and emergency measures. The webinar will last 40 to 45 minutes, and we will open the floor to questions at the end. Please remember to post your answers in the chat box only. I will read it out to Dr. Kuehl as I'm receiving the questions. Dr. Kuehl will also be conducting webinars for the next 2 weeks, April 8th and April 15th. Please be on the lookout for registration information on those 2 upcoming webinars. And now, Dr. Chris Kuehl.
All right, thank you very much, and I hope we're all having a good time sheltered behind our mounds of toilet paper. We'll talk more about that as we go through. As we begin this, we're sort of in the middle of what has been described as a black swan event. Black swan events, something that was developed within the philosophical circles probably 100 years ago, but economists have been using it as a term for maybe the last 10 or 15. And what it refers to is an unexpected but expected event. We have been dealing with viruses for almost every one of the last 10 to 15 years. And the last decade, it's been fairly constant. We've had MERS, we've had SARS, we've had Ebola, Marburg, Zika, we've had swine flu, avian flu, we've had H1N1 and every conceivable kind of new flu strain one can imagine. So it was not unexpected that we would be dealing with another epidemic, another issue around viruses. We didn't know exactly how, we didn't know exactly where, we didn't know exactly how it would manifest, but we knew that it was coming to one degree or another. And one of the conversations that will definitely take place after we put this crisis is what could we have done differently as far as anticipating this? What will we have to do in the future to make sure that we don't have an annual COVID-19 shutdown that the economy would have to deal with? So we'll talk a little bit about what we know and then get pretty swiftly into the economic part. We'll talk somewhat about the virus itself, but I'm not that kind of doctor, and I don't plan to suddenly turn into an epidemiologist. However, I have noticed that there are an awful lot of people out in in the social media world now that have begun pontificating with not a lot of background. I read this very, very long critical dissertation, and everything anybody was doing was wrong, all this sort of stuff, and I should know, I'm a doctor. And at the very end of it, you discover that he's a dermatologist. No offense to Dr. Pimple Popper, but that's not really who I want to hear from when all this is taking place. I'm a lot more interested in people who have made this more of a study. So what do we know so far? Not a lot. There's a lot more unknown than there is known. First off, we knew that the economic impact was fairly immediate as far as the markets were concerned. They collapsed virtually globally, but have since been fairly volatile. One thing to point out, though, about the markets is that the markets were already becoming a little uneasy. There were an awful lot of people who had been talking about the overvalued market and the need for a correction and all sort of stuff months ago. And a lot of conjecture among people in the investment community as to what it would take to push the markets into a more retreat-oriented position, and this was the trigger. So I don't know that the market reaction would have been as extreme as it was if there wasn't already a sense of being poised for bad news. We know that the supply chains were shattered, and this obviously has had a huge impact on people in the supply business. An awful lot of parts, assemblies, whole machines come from China, from Asia in general, from Vietnam and Taiwan and India and Latin America, and you name it. So that supply chain disruption was the first iteration of this. This is something we began to deal with in January. Many of those are starting to make a bit of a comeback. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But for example, if you go to the epicenter of where the COVID-19 virus began, Hubei province, Wuhan in China, they're already back to production. They are already returning to work in substantial numbers. The restrictions have mostly been removed. The emergency hospitals have been closed. A piece of data that isn't even in the slides this time because it's too new, it just came out today. The Purchasing Managers Index for most of the world has been released. It's going to be released for the U.S. as well in very short order. And it's fairly predictable. It shows an awful lot of decline, but there's some very surprising developments within that set of readings. Most notably, the Purchasing Managers Index for China. Now, those of you who are not familiar with the PMI, it's a really useful tool that economists have used for a long time because it's current, it's a survey, so it's current month to month, and purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. Most people, when they're submitting to a survey, are fudging things to a certain extent. They're trying to influence the outcome. They're trying to give an answer that is going to make the interviewer happy. Purchasing managers, you're just told, are you buying more or less of something? And it's a pretty simple response. I'm buying more. Okay. I'm buying less. Okay. Are you buying more steel? Yeah. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. Someone says we need to buy more steel and we're out of toilet paper. So their information is accurate, and it gives you a nice running month-to-month idea of what's happening in the industrial economy as well as the service economy. The other beauty of the PMI is that it's done for 38 countries in exactly the same way. So you can compare the U.S. with Japan, with China, with Brazil, with Mexico. China had a tremendous drop in their PMI numbers last month. They went from being in the 50s, which signals growth. Anything over 50 is growth. Anything under 50 is contraction. They dropped all the way to 40. So they had a tremendous decline, and one that would clearly suggest that they were in decline, in crisis. Most of the more optimistic assessments for this month thought that maybe China would get back to 45, 46, still in contraction, but better than they were. They hit 50.9. So they're back into growth numbers now, and that is a stunning reversal. In 1 month's time, they gained 10 points. And that rarely happens in PMIs. So what it signals is that China went back to work. And if that's a pattern that other countries will follow, European, us, that's pretty encouraging stuff. That would indicate that when the all clear is sounded to one degree or another, people respond. And we'll talk more about how that plays out a little later in this webinar. The government mandated shutdowns, we know that. And this has been creating a very unusual kind of recession. And we'll talk more about what plays out momentarily. But generally, recessions are not created. They sort of emerge because there's a problem in the economy. The 2008 recession, the banking sector became horribly unstable because of their dependence on the mortgage-backed securities, and people overinvested and the MBSs weren't what they were supposed to be, and then suddenly the credit dried up and the LIBOR rate was out of control and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was a very, very obvious financial sector collapse, and it took the entire world economy down with it. The trouble with those kinds of recessions is they tend to be lingering. The damage is extensive and it takes a long time to rebound. This one is a man-made recession. This was an economy in the US and Europe, elsewhere, that was doing just fine. I mean, it was booming, but it was doing relatively well. And then all of a sudden it was like, shut everything down. We're going to close all the restaurants. We're going to close the stores. We're going to close sporting events. We're going to close everything. And you plunge the world into recession. The good news to that is that if you can push the country into recession with the slowdowns and the shutdowns, you can then lift the recession once you decide to lift the shutdown. So this has the silver lining of we put ourselves here, we can take ourselves out of it when we decide that that moment has arrived. We know that the central banks have done pretty much everything they can do. They've lowered rates to zero, bond buying, they're doing everything they can to stimulate liquidity. The problem is that liquidity means getting money into the hands of consumers and then letting consumers do their thing. The consumer is what bails you out. The consumer takes the money that it's getting from the bank loans, and the consumer is taking money that it's getting from expanded business, etc. Well, when there's nothing to buy, there's nothing consumers to do. Almost 65% of what we consume in the United States is services. So if you suddenly cut off restaurants and stores and sporting events and all that kind of stuff, well, you cut off 65% of what consumers spend their money on. So all the liquidity efforts have been hampered by the fact that consumers have been hampered. We finally had congressional action, we'll talk about it in a minute, and perhaps most importantly, we have seen some countries make pretty significant progress. Some of them have done it in very different ways than we have. The nation that is kind of being held up as the example of how to do this properly has been South Korea. South Korea did several things very early, very differently than most other countries did. They tested first responders, hospital personnel right away, without any delay at all. They wanted to make sure that that population was safe. Number two, they began to test those who were at risk first. So they went after the elderly, those with compromised immune systems, etc. The idea was to find the infected population as fast as it possibly could and then isolate them completely. It was mandatory quarantines. It wasn't suggesting social distance. It wasn't eventually shutting down the stores. Like, you have the virus, you are being put in quarantine. And most of the time that meant in hospital, not at home. The other thing about South Korea is that you've got a country that is constantly in kind of invasion mode. They are always worried about what the North Koreans are going to do, and this country is threat oriented. An example, anybody who's been to South Korea has probably seen this, but a colleague of mine was there checking into a hotel when the sound went off for a drill. The guy that was behind the counter, who was in a suit and tie, instantly was in a set of fatigues holding an automatic weapon. And he's like, I turned my back for a minute, and this guy transformed. And then I asked, I said, how? He says, I wear my fatigues under my suit, so that when the drill starts, I simply strip off my suit. I'm now in my fatigues, and my automatic weapon is underneath the desk. Really? Well, yeah. We're 20 miles from the North Korean border here. We have to be ready. This is a country that is used to responding to government orders. The government says we're under threat, do something, the population does so. I mean, if you've seen the streets in South Korea, they're jammed. And then there's a drill and they're empty. People respond immediately. So South Korea now is one of the countries that has seen the peak and has seen pretty substantial recovery. That may be kind of a marker for other countries to come. If you look at where the peak has been manifesting, again, it has reached that point in most of the Asian states. It has reached it in China, it's reached it in South Korea, probably has reached it in Japan, has reached it in Singapore. Other parts of the world, Europe, still climbing, the U.S. still climbing, and that is to be expected. Of course, it did it in every other country as well. If we look at how the virus stacks up and how it's been performing in places that have been dealing with it longer, the good news on this chart is that there are a lot more recoveries in China than there were fatalities. The fatality rate was high, 3.8%, partly because the only people that were reporting early on were those that were seriously ill. The vast majority of the people who had it weren't reporting it because they didn't know they had it, and it hadn't manifested in a way that made people over concerned. It felt to those people like a cold or the flu, no big deal. The fatality rate now is thought to be around 1.4 to 1.5%. That is not ridiculously high. It's kind of comparable to some of the worst of the seasonal flus that we've seen in the last several years. Not as deadly as some of the viral outbreaks that we've seen. The challenge with COVID-19 is that it spreads so fast. Compared to the seasonal flus that we have, it's much more virulent. And that is the biggest worry, is that it's going to hit more people faster than previous types of viral infections, and that tends to strain and overwhelm the system. If you look at how it compares to those other viruses, it is not as fatal as SARS, as MERS, as bird flu, as Ebola, as smallpox, for example. Even really as viral and as deadly as the pandemic flu back in the World War I days, the Spanish flu. Somewhere in that pink box, more deadly than the usual strains of seasonal flu, more deadly than the cold, certainly in the category of a deadly virus. The challenge is that it spreads faster. So when compared to some of the deadliest strains, they do not propagate in the way that this one does. And that's what makes governments very nervous and concerned. You can see that it has declined in China. This is just looking at really kind of Hubei province compared to the rest of the world. Hubei is in yellow, reached a peak in February, has fallen since then, has continued to drop to the point that they've declared the virus a kind of a defeated enemy at this stage. In China as a whole, you still have outbreaks in different parts of China, so it has peaked. It is no longer as virulent and as omnipresent as it was, but it's still popping up in other parts of China, so it has not completely followed the Hubei province pattern. For the rest of the world, still growing. Still an issue in Europe, still an issue in the U.S. The next wave we're beginning to see already is going to be in places like Latin America and Africa. They have not seen as much of it up until this, but that is rapidly changing. And by the time this morphs, the parts of the world that are going to be most affected will be Latin America and Africa. They are the least prepared, given the resources needed to deal with this, and they will, in much more dramatic fashion, be waiting for cures and vaccines as opposed to the control mechanisms that we've been using. You can see that it has spread other parts of the world faster now than China. This is kind of the good news slide. It has peaked in China. It has not peaked elsewhere. So it is continuing to grow outside the Asian area. On the other hand, the reassuring thing is that when it hit peak in China, it stayed there. And you didn't get another outbreak and another outbreak. The biggest challenge for the Asian states now are people who are returning home from other parts of the world who have the disease, and so they're trying to watch borders a lot more aggressively than they had been. Death toll, we originally thought that it was only affecting the elderly. We know that's not the case. The problem was that people who were younger and healthier didn't think they had anything particularly serious, and they didn't ask anybody. Now, people snooze twice and they go to the emergency room saying, "Oh my God, I've got COVID-19." And says, "No, that's tree pollen. You're okay. You have allergies. You hit them every year. You are not manifesting any of the other symptoms for COVID-19." But prior to this, people could have been dealing with this and not have a clue and wouldn't have gone anywhere for help. So we never had an idea who was not infected. We now are getting into the economics part. Finally, we're leaving the doctor stuff behind, and I'm on a lot more secure ground at this point. Early on, there were a lot of people that didn't really take this that seriously. I mean, if you had asked a month or so ago how many people were concerned about COVID-19, it would have been a fairly small number. It was considered a small aberration. There are a handful of cases in the U.S. It was a Chinese issue. It was an Asian issue. You know, we're not going to get hit. Oh, yeah, now it's an Italian issue. It's still not us. That's changed. Now you have fully 70% of the population thinking this is an issue and wanting to do something about it. One of the things I love about charts like this, there's the neither concerned or unconcerned population. These people all just drive me crazy. It's like, how do you not have an opinion at this point? You either think it's an issue or you don't. This is the group that is still trying to figure out what Kim Kardashian's going to do next. It just drives me insane. But there they are. The global response to this has been mixed, but there's been a lot of similarities. Almost every country that has dealt with this has done some sort of spending boost because they know that it's a dual threat issue. You've got the health issue, you've also got the economic issue. So they've been trying to push spending as much as possible. There have also been tax cuts, and a few countries have tried to do support for the market. You've seen engagement with banks. The United States has been almost entirely, up until recently, oriented towards rate cuts. It was being left to the monetary authorities. Now we're also getting into spending. The $2 trillion spending bill. Still haven't done much as far as tax cuts, really haven't done much when it comes to market support. Some of that $2 trillion will end up being involved with the banks, but not nearly as targeted as some of the other countries have been. We know the market took a hit, but it has been rebounding somewhat. The volatility is back, as I mentioned earlier. This was something that was probably going to happen anyway to a degree. It's more dramatic than people expected it to be, but the market was a little bit shaky even before the virus issue appeared. So, well, I told you never to call me here. I apologize for that. What sectors have gotten hit the hardest? You have everything from the banking sector in China got nailed hard, the investment sector got nailed hard, retail got nailed. Pretty familiar. I mean, this is the same sort of things that were appearing in other countries. Europe has been hit this way. We've obviously been hit this way. The good news is those sectors have tended to rebound fairly quickly, and that's really the key to getting out of this, is how quickly people go back to their normal patterns. If we are continuing to be worried and concerned, you take that 3.3 million people who lost their jobs. Those jobs were not lost because the businesses they worked for were suddenly not viable. The businesses they worked for were doing fine. The hotels were fine. The airlines were fine. The restaurants fine. We had a good retail sector performance last year. these businesses were booming, and not maybe to the point that they were 2 or 3 years ago, but this was a healthy economy. We were growing at least 2%, probably closer to 2.5. When those businesses are allowed to reopen, the assumption is they'll resume, and they may resume at a higher level than they were prior to the shutdown. You can almost count on it when it comes to the restaurant business. People are going to be going crazy, going out and trying to go out to eat again. Airlines may be a little bit slower, and this may be a factor in terms of what people believe. If you're still worried about the virus, do you fly? If you're still worried about the virus, do you go to Disney World? We're going to be around a lot of other people. If you're worried about the virus, you might go to a restaurant because you feel like you've got a little bit of control over who you're interacting with. So a lot of it's going to be attitude when it comes right down to it. One of the other indices I look at a lot, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm the economist for the National Association for Credit Management, and we do our version of a survey similar to the Purchasing Managers Index called, cleverly enough, the Credit Managers Index. It's stressed. You can tell by that rather dark red, nasty dropping monthly total on the far right. But what's interesting about this is why it dropped, because the specifics on this are intriguing. There we go. The key points that came out of the latest CMI. There are two sections of our survey. The first section is what we call favorables. The second section is the unfavorables. Favorables to a credit manager are sales, applications for credit, dollar collections, number or amount of credit extended, the things that make a credit manager happy. The unfavorables are things like bankruptcies, accounts out for collection, disputes, slow pays, things that make a credit manager's life miserable. All of the damage was in the favorables. The favorable numbers fell like crazy. Sales cratered. We have the same system that PMI has. Anything over 50 is good, under 50 is bad. The sales numbers fell to 39. I mean, they haven't been in 30s since the 2008 recession. The unfavorables didn't change much. There hasn't been time. Companies are not yet in trouble. They're not at the point where they can't pay their bills yet. They're not out for collection action yet. They're not dealing with bankruptcies. They're not dealing with any of that stuff except slow pays. We have basically seen the slow pay numbers get much worse because people are hoarding their cash. They are trying to stall their creditors as long as they can to keep their cash flow. So again, timing is critical. If these companies can come back with some confidence within a month or two, they probably won't get to the point that they'll be looking at bankruptcies and auctions. It'll be a bad part of the year that they can recover from, but timing will be everything. This is not the worst situation we've been through. We've had worse periods, obviously the 2008 recession, the collapse in 1987. This is a recession that feels a lot like the 9/11 recession. It was an event-driven recession then. This is an event-driven recession now. We didn't know what was happening in 9/11. We were afraid this was the beginning of a war, that there were going to be more attacks, more buildings brought down, more terrorist attacks. We froze, and we froze for 2 or 3 months. Then we realized that, okay, maybe we're on top of this. Maybe this is a one-shot deal. Maybe we're okay. And we started to kind of drift back to normal patterns. This is likely to be more like the 9/11 crisis than the 2008 crisis. And as long as we feel like we're getting a handle on it sooner than later. The Fed has done what it's done lately before, many times before. It's kind of the default response of the monetary authorities to increase liquidity. So we've done it over the stock market crash, the mortgage crisis, 9/11, the tech bubble. We're doing it now because of coronavirus. So even though it feels somewhat unprecedented, it is certainly a fairly common response. And if you listen to the Fed right now, they are not talking about putting those rates back up anytime this year. Even if we recover in May or June, they're going to leave rates low for quite a while. If we really start to boom by the end of the year and inflation becomes an issue, there's a possibility that they would be able to respond. And that is unlikely at this stage, but there's a possibility. You certainly have hawks within the Fed who are concerned that rates are at rock bottom and leave them with no ammunition for any kind of problem in the future. But they also understand that the country is going to be fragile for the next several months, and there's no reason to rush things. If you look at the economic impact globally, again, just a quick reminder, 20 wasn't expected to be a particularly good year anyway. We were looking at probably sub 6% growth in China. Rather, we were probably looking at 3% growth globally, which is about 2 points slower than normal. The U.S. was going to be around 1.5%, 2% growth. So we weren't really in a particularly healthy place anyway. You add in something like the viral outbreak, and it just sank things much further, much faster. But it's something to remember that being in the circumstance we're in now, we're kind of on the cusp of it anyway before this broke out. Chances of a deep recession, it really kind of depends on the perspective of timing. Once again, most of the economists are thinking that we are maybe looking at a deep recession for a quarter or two, but not very many are seeing it beyond that. And we'll talk a little bit more about V's and U's and L-shaped recessions here in a moment. But there's still a fairly confident sense among economists that we would pull out of this before the end of the year. And we'll talk about how that plays out here in a moment. So here's the government response, kind of the bailout of the century. Some of it is political theater. The $1,200 check for everyone is kind of political silliness. That is 2 weeks' wages for a minimum wage worker making $15 an hour, assuming that they get a 40-hour week. Yay. So you've lost your job. You're probably not going to get your job back for at least a month or two, so we're giving you 2 weeks' pay. This is not going to change your life. Most of the people who are getting the money are reporting that they plan to save it anyway, so it's not going to be a stimulative addition, but it's a nice feel-good gesture. You know, we care about you deeply. Here's some money. The really important stuff is going to come out of the loans that are being offered to small and large business. There are lots of provisos attached to those loans. Now, the details of this, like with most legislation, is still being worked out. This thing was 900 pages long. But the gist of it is that if you are going to get money from this fund, you have certain obligations. One of those is to not fire people. If you lay off your workforce, you are not going to be eligible for much of this money, if any of it. If you are going to engage in activity that is not stimulative to the economy, you're not going to get any of this money either. There are supposedly restrictions on doing stock buybacks. People who are part of the administration and part of Congress will not be eligible for this bailout. And that's fairly common. Whenever there's bailout money, it's unlikely or it's usually restricted, and people who are part of the bailing part don't get access to that money. There will likely be a provision that allows the government to take an equity stake in some of these companies, particularly the airlines. So the airlines will be looking to get a lot of money to get them through this period, and the government will end up owning stock. This is similar to what they did with GM a few years ago, when the bailout carried with it a proviso that the government would get shares of GM stock. The idea was that when GM recovered, the equity would be worth more. The government would then sell it and recoup some of the money that was given to GM, which is exactly what happened. The government stake was sold at a pretty decent price, and a good part of that bailout was recovered. That's the idea now. The airlines would get money. back. That's the general idea. Supposedly $100 billion going to the healthcare sector, primarily for equipment and testing kits and anything else that is required that's in short supply. This is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the issues. $2 trillion is a lot of money, but the losses that have been taken in the economy far exceed $2 trillion. There are other programs being discussed. There's a talk of an infrastructure spend. That would be something of interest to the Supply Association and its members, because that conversation has been going on for at least the last 17 centuries. We need infrastructure money. We have needed it for a long time. Everything in the infrastructure is weak these days, and we always seem to complain about it and never put any money towards it. This may be an opportunity to throw more money at infrastructure, but it's not going to be a particularly useful gesture as far as jobs are concerned. There's always this notion that, well, if we stimulate construction, that'll be good for employment. Yeah, maybe 20, 30 years ago, where a lot of the people working in construction did very basic jobs. That's not the situation now. Construction is short labor. They don't have enough skilled people now. And the guy that working for Olive Garden last week and got fired is not going to suddenly turn up as a construction worker or as a road builder or as a bridge builder. At least I certainly hope not. So it's going to be good for the economy long term, and it will certainly put money into the hands of a lot of businesses. But as a rescue for the employment situation, probably not all that germane. Sectors of highest risk, again, fairly predictable. High tech was hit by the supply chain disruption out of China. Retail has been hit. Apparel has been hit. Anything that's connected to consumer spending right now. Not as much of a hit in automotive, though that's starting to show up a little bit. And pharma has not been hurt, so kind of for obvious reasons. So we've got some split in terms of how this is playing out. A sector that's vitally important to the supply people is energy. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. The energy sector has been hit really from two different directions at once. And one of them is connected to the virus and the other isn't. Demand is way down. There's not nearly as much activity. Consumers aren't driving. They're not driving to work, driving to spend. So the demand levels have fallen significantly. But the bigger issue has been the oil war that has been launched by our good friends in the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia. So until that's resolved, there's going to be some real problems. The price per barrel of oil has fallen to $20. Little over 20 when it comes to Brent crude. That's about $20 a barrel less than the American oil producer can make money on. So there are some serious issues on the energy sector. There's not a lot of pipeline activity. There's not going to be a lot of new drilling until demand recovers. The good news, if there is such a thing in this regard, would be that when the restrictions are lifted, that demand will shoot up dramatically. One of the expectations, though, is that enough producers will have gone out of business or shut down during this period that when they are seeing demand recover, they're going to struggle to get back up to the needed amounts, and we see a really rapid rebound in prices. Depending on who you are talking to, there's a discussion of seeing the pump price go from what it is now, $1.80, $1.75 in some places, to upper threes, low fours by the end of the year, end of summer perhaps, because suddenly demand recovers and there's an insufficient supply. It's going to come down to timing. The areas that are most likely to be hurt in the U.S. have a lot to do with population and what drives the local economy. Vegas is in big trouble. That town has literally been shut down. I mean, everything you can think of that drives the Vegas economy has been closed. Same sort of thing in Florida. Any place with a high population of tourist-dependent industries and things that are dependent on energy. By looking at this map, it is quite obvious that we all need to move to Alaska or possibly to parts of North and South Dakota, but not where the energy is. I am proud to say that most of my great state of Kansas seems to be unaffected. That's because nobody lives in western Kansas, but we could be the first. It's pretty obvious it's going to be where population centers are. This is where the majority of the job losses will be, and this is the area that's been damaged thus far. We're in the middle of the second of these impact areas. We're just starting to get into the third. We've been through the China slowdown part. That's now beginning to rectify a little. We're now in the middle of the localized outbreaks with work stoppages and consumer sentiment falling, etc. Next up is the financial stress, and we're just starting to get that. We're seeing a lot of impact on the market, but banks are tightening their conditions because as much as they want to help, and honestly do, how do they make a loan decision right now? You know, a company is saying, I need some money to get me through, and the bank is like, yeah, but how long? I mean, maybe you bounce back, maybe you don't, and how does my business survive all this? So when you go to, all right, can I get the next slide to move here? I see a little cursor moving around, but it's not mine. Here we go. There we go. So this chain I've mentioned 2 or 3 times already. It's already had a big impact on the tech sector, which is expected because a lot of these parts come from Asia, but it's also beginning to affect other sectors. You're seeing a little bit of relief in that area as Asia comes back to life. China matters to most countries in the world because they sell to it, and we don't particularly. It's around 6 to 7% of our exports, which is very small. But the rest of the world does, and we sell to those countries. So if Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea, blah, 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 if they're not selling to China, then they're not buying from us. So that's part of why we have been impacted, not just by this, but by the trade war and the tariff wars that were going on before. And if you've been noticing the news, a lot of those tariffs are now being temporarily lifted and maybe permanently lifted, because if we're going to rebuild the world economy, we're going to need China's participation. It's early to say that the trade war may have ended with this, but it has certainly been put on hold, and that's going to be good news for anybody who has been sourcing from China but has been paying extra to do that because of the tariffs. There's still quite a bit of optimism about where the economy goes by the end of this year and into next. You can see that with even the worst case scenario, you're coming out of this by third quarter really of this year, and you're kind of back to the normal baseline by next year. The best case scenario has us coming out of this within a matter of weeks. Not sure that one really is viable at this stage. I think we're probably looking for something maybe in between the best and the worst case scenario. And the 3 that are sort of out there, V-shaped recession is the preferred model. It's short, sharp, you come back in a hurry, things go back to where they were. The U is similar to the V, but you linger at the bottom for a while, and it may be 1 or 2 quarters, it may be 3, but then you eventually get back to growth. The dreaded recession is the L, which is what we got after 2008. That was a short, sharp recession followed by a really slow recovery. I mean, we were still dealing with recession in 2014, 2015. It just took forever to get out of that recession. It was very, very sometimes described as the checkmark recession because of its shape. So what do we have to do to get to those outcomes? What would give us the good outcome? The virus threat would fade. Consumers would react strongly to the all clear, get right back to their old patterns. The government would leave liquidity in play and continue to support. The virus would fade in key markets as well, and the infrastructure in the U.S. would hold up, particularly the electronic infrastructure, which is right now experiencing strain. we're going to get the U version kind of in between. The virus doesn't fade as quickly as we hoped. People refuse to take the isolation seriously and keep spreading it. Consumers stay cautious after the all clear, don't go back to normal right away. The government sucks back its support too fast. The Fed raises rates, the money dries up. The virus continues to spread in key markets to the U.S. And begins to affect us that way. And the infrastructure that we're now depending on to work from home collapses, and we end up in bigger trouble than we were. The ugly outcome, the L, I don't think is at all likely, but you have to talk about it. This is the virus morphing into something worse. Panic takes control. Businesses shut down en masse. The government can't help anymore, and we are suddenly in a zombie apocalypse, and we all just go live in a yurt someplace in Alaska. This is not very likely. It is not likely at all. As a matter of fact, if we were looking at something like this, we probably would be experiencing it already. Other things are going on in the world. I kind of mentioned this already. The oil war, Brexit still happening. I like the last from the bottom, there's a locust infestation, for crying out loud. We are one horseman away from the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We have pestilence, we have disease, we have war. All we're missing is mass famine. So this is get biblical at this rate. But there's other problems in the world beyond COVID-19. There's the oil data, as we all know, collapsed, gone to very low levels. Will come back once the demand comes back, and if we can get the Saudis and Russians to lay off their attack. We are probably looking at a halfway decent 2021, even if we don't recover as quickly as we hoped in 2020. That will, of course, depend on our not repeating this next year. I mean, we know that these viral outbreaks tend to appear in the winter months, so we should be preparing globally for what happens next year. And then finally, just consensus view about what this economy will do this year. Most are still thinking that we are going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 1 3/4 growth by the end of this year. Not awful, not deep recession, something close to what we had in 2016 or 2013. Not where we'd like to be. We were hoping to be around 2.5% by the end of this year, but this is not necessarily catastrophic. And then I basically leave you with this. This is what the world has come to. Now the things of value are toilet paper and hand sanitizer. It's not that I don't understand hoarding. I do get hoarding. I understand it's a response to insecurity. I can't say that I understand toilet paper hoarding. Personally, when this began I went to the local wine store and bought 2 cases of wine. I mean, there are substitutes for toilet paper. Come on now. But there are no substitutes for good Cabernet Sauvignon. So one sets one's priorities. And I did indeed respond to the potential threat. Those of you who want more, you know who you are. I do a lot of writing. I'm just as long-winded in print and in public. If you're not already subscribing to the Business Intelligence Brief, it has now turned into the Plague Report. It's almost all COVID all the time, and hopefully that will change soon. But it's free, and you can get more of it. And in the meantime, I'm going to shut up because Aisha is by all accounts collecting questions in the chat room, and we can go to that part.
Yes, I was going to ask everybody to please post their questions. We will be waiting for the questions to come up. So let's play the waiting game now.
That's right. That's right.
Yep. I like your slide in the end about when the casinos go out of business, so people are going to start betting with toilet paper and hand sanitizer.
Exactly. The things that have suddenly become of great value. So.
Right. And your next webinar is it going to be like different about the next webinar?
Yeah, the next 2 webinars will obviously be updates. We get new information about what's happening with the economy and with the virus literally every day. So
Mm-hmm.
there'll be the new data. We would expect, given the way we've seen the stuff rolling out in the last week, things would be progressively better. I think we'll be spending a lot of energy looking at the Asian countries between now and next week, because that's where we've seen all of the progress. We'll be watching to see what's happening in China, South Korea, Singapore, elsewhere. And then also trying to figure out how the U.S. economy is responding to this. And then probably the last webinar will spend a lot more energy on what do we look like after this is over, and what steps would we be taking now to get ready for that aftermath.
Yeah. Okay, one question is, when is the peak in U.S. going to be, in your opinion?
And bear in mind that I'm not an epidemiologist, so the question had to do with when I think the peak is going to be. The consensus view is mid-April. So for the most part, you're hearing people say second week, third week of April should be the peak. I tend to agree with that. Most of the predictions that have been made about what's happening in Asia and Europe have been pretty accurate. So that would be my guess at this stage.
Okay. All right. Still waiting for some more.
One thing I've also noticed about the reaction to COVID-19, I've seen more neighbors walking in the last week than I have seen in the entire 15 years that I've lived here. And they all have the most exhausted dogs I've ever seen. These dogs are, you have not asked me to move for 10 years. Now you are dragging me up and down the street 5 times a day. And the dogs just look like, I am going to hide the leash. Would you leave me alone? So it's I didn't even know these people lived here. So.
Okay. Another question is how to access the Black Owl report.
Yes, all you have to send me an email, and we will send you a trial to the Black Owl. This is one of 2 publications we do. This is the subscription-based one, so it's $84 a year, $7 a month, but you can get it free for a month, and hopefully within a month we'll stop reading about COVID-19. So for the next month, it's going to be everything you can possibly want to know about the COVID-19 from my partner and myself.
Okay. Another question, and I know that you did mention it, but if you could just sort of go over it quickly again, is which scenario do you think is most likely to occur amongst the good, the bad, and the ugly?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we're still in the good category, with a little bit of leaning towards elements of the bad. I don't think we'll be out of this quite as quickly as a V-shaped recession would indicate, but I think it'll be a pretty short U. It seems to me that the majority of the damage is going to be April, and then by May we're going to see more recovery. It would not surprise me if certain of the businesses began to reopen, particularly in certain parts of the country, and that will sort of take some of the edge off the recession. So I'm thinking kind of a 6 to 8 week period if you count the last 2 weeks of March and into April. So I'm hoping for, what would that be, a kind of partly good, partly bad.
Okay, partly good, partly bad. Well, that's not so bad. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, that's like the meteorologists that say it's partly cloudy, which is their way of saying I have no idea.
Yeah, I know. It's really like that. I'm waiting for more questions. So how is it? Do you still have empty aisles in your neighborhood stores?
You know, it's kind of been interesting what we've observed. I mean, Kansas City is not an epicenter at this stage for a lot of this. It's not New York. It's not some of the areas that have been hardest hit. And the stores are still in pretty good shape. They're out of certain things. I mean, you'll look at, like, the canned goods aisle gets hit, and the toilet paper aisle gets hit, but everything else is there. The dairy products run hasn't taken place. People have been fairly good about keeping the social distance thing, but what I've also noticed is, and they're doing the same thing I'm doing, that's taking advantage of the opportunity to get stuff done in the yard because it's spring, and the home improvement stores are doing quite well. So we're all deciding that, well, it is a necessity to put the weed preventer on now. It's like if I want to keep the crabgrass away.
Okay. Another question we have is, how bad will the oil situation get before getting better?
Yeah, the oil situation is going to be something that's going to depend entirely on what the consumers do. If the consumers go back to their normal demand patterns, and this is really globally, not just here, the oil price crash is probably not going to last much through midsummer at the very latest. It would probably start coming back up in May. The big question at this stage is, can we blunt the Saudi-Russian attack? There have been diplomatic interactions, but some of this is just they've been waiting for an opportunity to deal a blow to the U.S. oil production, and they have found their moment, and they are taking advantage of it. So this is partly COVID related, and it's partly the animosity that exists between us and countries that periodically claim to be our allies. I think it's pretty clear they're not and never have been.
Wow. Okay, well, we did hear, another question is, we did hear that the ozone layer is actually healing now that everybody's in their homes. And
exactly.
The marine life is also actually improving, which is good. I know once everything goes back to normal, businesses go back to the old practices, it's probably going to start going bad again. I mean,
yeah, it's been kind of interesting. We've conducted an involuntary experiment on what it would be like if the industrial capacity of the world was reduced. And so all of the things that are related to global warming and climate change, they've all been altered, at least temporarily, because even just looking at China alone, you can tell from space that the pollution levels are far, far less than what they used to be. So we're kind of getting a taste of saying, if we could actually control some of this without sending the world into recession, that might be a positive. And there will be other changes as well, because as I mentioned earlier, we now are all experiencing working from home and working remotely and all that stuff. People have talked about for decades, but never actually did. Now we're doing it, and a lot of companies may say, this worked pretty well. Maybe we should keep it this way. Maybe we should continue having these virtual meetings. People are productive at home. Or we're going to come back and say, nope, this isn't working because all of our employees have murdered their spouses. They have sent their children to boarding schools, and they have been buying guns and shooting their toilet paper. They can't stand being alone anymore. We'll find out. We'll find out how well this is going to work.
Okay. Another question. Do you have any insights into the transportation industry? Could that impact the supply chain if this pandemic continues?
Yeah, it's possible. I think there was an impact pretty obviously in January and in February. And I think that you're probably going to see an extension of that supply chain issue, at least for the duration of the pandemic. It's kind of shifted as to where the supply chain issue has been originating. It's been Asia from the beginning. Now it's become a supply chain issue out of Europe, and it eventually becomes a little bit of one for here in terms of who we supply and how we buy. The next wave, as I mentioned, is Latin America and Africa. Then you have new supply chain issues there. We have not really dealt with, for example, what's going to happen if we're importing a lot of food from Latin America, which we consistently do. Is that going to be affected by the virus epidemic as well?
Right. I actually have another question myself. I mean, everybody's working from home, and I know, the bandwidth's probably heavily loaded. I wonder how well equipped are all these internet companies to handle the load. It may be short term, it may be a few months.
Yeah, it's been a real strain, because I can tell you, just from having done several of these webinars over the last couple of weeks, you can really feel when the network is at its maximum. I see much faster speeds, for example, in the morning than I do as the day goes on. After about noon, things really begin to slow down. And I've had webinars that gotten interrupted, and I've had issues that telephone reception has not been good. I mean, we really are at the very edge of what this infrastructure can support, which will be one of those questions to revisit when this is done. Should this be made a lot more robust? And so I think probably is, of course, yes. How exactly? And what will people be expected to do? We have not, up to this point, had to have the most up-to-date fast speeds at home. Well, now we may have to. And I think anybody with a teenager already has them, because they've been able to keep up with video games. But the rest of us, a lot of boomers are like, well, come on now, I still have dial-up. It works for me. That's not going to work anymore.
I know, you're right. I don't know who still uses it. I haven't used it in so long. I have the maximum speed in my home. I have so many. Kids are like on each and every device are using the internet, including TVs. So I don't know who can work with a dial-up connection anymore.
Exactly.
Also another question: how do you interpret the unemployment numbers, and how quickly do you see the number going down once the pandemic eases?
Yeah, the unemployment numbers are, to a degree, artificial, because what you see was a mandated unemployment with all these various stores and things being closed. The good news is that when they open, those workers should come right back to work. And a lot of companies have tried to engage in furloughs and anything they can think of where they don't really lose the worker, that they're able to keep them close and hopefully regain them. In some ways, particularly with the expanded unemployment benefit are supposed to be with this government program, it will resemble what the auto industry does regularly every summer, when it lays off large numbers of its workforce while it retools the plants. So for a month or two, these people are, quote, unemployed, and they are receiving unemployment compensation. Then when the retrofit is done, they're all brought back, and now they're employed again. They never really left the employ of GM or Ford or whoever. They're there to return. The longer the people stay unemployed, the more likely it is that they will find other work, they will someplace else. But right now, most of the businesses that I talk to are keeping their employees as close as they can, trying to figure out how to pay if they can for another few weeks, hoping that when things go back to normal, they can bring them all back. This could be a very short event. Again, timing. If it's over in May, 1st of June, by the middle of the end of summer, we sort of look back on this with stories of what did you do during the COVID-19 outbreak, and we're back to normal.
Great. Okay, well, we're going to be wrapping it up here. It is 2:05 Central. Thank you for a very informative webinar, Chris, and thank you to all the attendees who attended the webinar. Please stay tuned for more info on our upcoming webinars. We will also be uploading this webinar's recording on our website, and we will be sending out information about that as well. So basically with that, we call it a day. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming and giving us such great information.
Very good. Thank you, and we'll see you in a week.
Yes, we will. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.